Following the successful release of our newest upgraded Stellaron Hunter, Silverwolf 999, the rest of our colleagues are making sure they aren't left in the dust. Mortenax Blade's kit is finally here, embracing his inner nihilism and bringing with him a plethora of debuffs and personal damage. So let's dive into his abilities and my first impressions on him. Mortenax Blade is a Fire Nihility character, because fire characters are only allowed to follow the Nihility path. Don't look at Sparksy. However, Blade breaks the curse of Fire Nihility supports being made for the Super Break archetype. Nihility characters in general tend to have a wide range of roles, stemming from crit DPSs like Acheron, debuffing supports like Pella, or DOT characters like Kafka. Blade is able to fulfill quite a few of these different Nihility niches, all on his own. First off, Blade is HP scaling to keep his kit in theme with his original version, and he even has HP draining mechanics littered throughout his kit, sort of making him feel like a Nihility Destruction hybrid. His basic attack is nothing special, save for the fact that it can taunt the enemy while dealing HP scaling fire damage to one target. It should be noted that Blade's taunt seemingly has no effect hit rate requirement. In fact, his kit in general seems to lack effect hit rate requirements, which is nice since that tends to be a bottleneck for some Nihility characters. Blade's skill is a bit special since it actually can't be used when he isn't in his ultimate's enhanced state. Therefore, we might as well talk about Blade's ultimate first. And yes, I know it's weird, but Blade is the first character who literally cannot press his skill button when a battle starts. He needs to enter his ultimate before the skill button becomes available to you. So let's go over Blade's ultimate, which has the lowest energy cost in the game at 80. Think of it as being similar to Firefly's in terms of how it functions. Blade presses his ultimate and enters his enhanced state, similarly to Firefly. Also similarly to Firefly, he creates a countdown on the action bar, and when that countdown takes action, Blade will exit his ultimate. So what does he do while in this enhanced state from his ultimate? First off, it applies a debuff called Balefire Bind, which decreases enemy defense by 30% and makes them take 50% more damage. So basically, it's 30% defense shred and a 50% vulnerability debuff all packed into his ultimate, which is a pretty crazy amount of debuffing. For reference, an E0 S1 Cypher debuffs enemies by 40% vulnerability and 24% defense shred. So Blade is already more than that at a baseline. Of course, Cypher also brings her true damage from her ultimate, but Blade is bringing some damage of his own, as we'll see. Anyway, his ultimate also applies a zone at the cost of 30% of Blade's HP. We'll get to the specifics of his zone later, but essentially, just think of his defense shred and vulnerability debuffs as being permanent while his zone is active, aka while he's in his ultimate's enhanced state. Once again, no effect hit rate required to apply these massive debuffs. While Blade is in his enhanced state, he increases his crit rate by 20% and his crit damage by 60%, and he now gains access to his skill, which he literally could not use before entering his ultimate. A few things to note about Blade's ultimate. The countdown timer has a speed of 70, which is the same speed as Firefly's countdown timer. Granted, Firefly is able to further delay her countdown timer after her Nova Flare, but the initial speed is the same, and so you can think of it as being similar to hers prior to her Nova Flare buff. While we've been doing a lot of comparisons between Blade and Firefly, it should be noted that Blade does not 100% action advance himself upon pressing his ultimate, which is really unfortunate since he starts a countdown timer without even giving himself an immediate turn within that countdown timer. Additionally, while he consumes HP upon casting his ultimate, he cannot fall below 1 HP. He will simply remain at 1 HP if the HP drain would theoretically kill him. If Blade does die from enemies attacking him, then instead of dying, he will merely exit his ultimate's enhanced state and get rid of the zone. Blade's ultimate actually gets replaced with a new enhanced ultimate ability upon entering his enhanced state. Think of this as being similar to Currency War's Firefly, where she has a damaging ultimate while she's in her enhanced state. This ultimate requires regular energy, just like his initial ultimate, and it simply deals a massive nuke of AoE fire damage. However, this second damaging ultimate of Blade's actually costs 160 energy instead of the initial 80 energy. Now then, let's finally talk about Blade's skill, since this is what you're going to be spamming while inside of his ultimate. Blade's skill consumes his HP, continuing on his destruction adjacent kit, and then deals AoE damage, followed by 4 instances of random bounce damage, all scaling off his HP. In terms of the scaling of Blade's skill, think of it as having similar scaling to Mighty's ultimate if all the bounces land on the same enemy, although the damage will usually be spread out a bit more if there are multiple enemies on the field. His skill does not consume skill points since it consumes his HP instead. And again, this is what you're mainly going to be spamming while inside of his enhanced state. A lot of the power in Blade's kit comes from his talent and traces though. First off, Blade's talent applies the defense shred and vulnerability debuffs every time an ally attacks within his zone, which is basically just a way to make sure there is absolutely zero downtime on his debuffs. Additionally, ally attacks grant him 1 charge, and he can hold up to 9 charge. Once he reaches 9 charge, he immediately consumes all of them to launch his skill, even outside of his own turn. This usage of his skill does not consume his own HP, and is considered a follow-up attack, and it regains an additional 25 energy alongside the usual 30 energy from his skill. So clearly Blade benefits a lot from allies who can attack frequently to stack charges for him, since he needs a whopping 9 charge to activate his follow-up attack skill. Battle, which gives him a ton of energy so that he can use his enhanced ultimate in his enhanced state. However, ally attacks aren't the only way to give Blade charge. Blade's second trace gives him a higher chance of being attacked, and he gains 1 charge whenever enemies attack him. So the amount of charge he gets, and thus the amount of follow-up attacks he can launch, and the amount of energy he gets for more ultimates is largely dependent on the frequency of ally attacks and the frequency of enemy attacks, which is pretty cool. His entire kit will be massively boosted in Pure Fiction, or just any AoE scenarios, where there are always 5 enemies who can attack very frequently. And it just so happens that his ultimate is also AoE, and he already inherently synergizes with frequent attackers like Tribby, who is also great in Pure Fiction. What a coincidence. Blade's first trace allows him to overflow 80 energy over the maximum, or in other words, storing up to double his baseline energy. It's similar to Saber in this energy overflow mechanic. When he activates his ultimate, the overflow energy is immediately given to him, obviously after consuming his current energy. Additionally, he will instantly set his energy to 50% when entering battle or when exiting his ultimate to help him build up to his next ultimate. Note that he isn't gaining that energy on top of what he already has. He's just setting his energy to half, regardless of his current energy, unless his current energy is already more than half, of course. Then, his trace 3 is a pretty big one. First off, he just increases the entire team's damage by 50% for completely free with no conditions. Mind you, Sunday's skill only does this for a single ally if they don't have a summon. Anyway, Blade's trace then has a further damage bonus with some conditions. Well, sort of. He gives an extra 50% follow-up attack damage boost with no conditions, so that's 100% damage bonus total for follow-up attacks. So, if you were wondering what Hoyo did to Ashvale's 80% follow-up attack damage buff from his beta, I guess we found it. However, if you have another Nihility character on the team with Blade, then this extra 50% follow-up attack damage bonus instead turns into 50% ultimate damage bonus. So basically, for Acheron. It's a pretty neat way of giving Blade the ability to play with both Acheron and follow-up attack teams. Although I seem to remember another character who was mainly designed to be able to play with both Acheron and follow-up attack teams. Weird how it happened twice. Anyway, here's a compilation of all the buffs Mortenax Blade is providing to the team. 30% defense thread, 50% vulnerability, 50% damage bonus, and an extra 50% damage bonus to either follow-up attack damage or to ultimate damage, depending on if he's solo Nihility or not. This is a lot of buffs. The only Nihility character who can match this is E4 Welt, who gives 40% defense thread, upwards of 100% damage bonus, granted you have to stack it, and a 35% res pen. From there, the differences become Blade's personal damage contribution versus Welt's ability to enable more comfortable sustainless teams via his action delays. Both are very powerful, and Blade is genuinely offering a pretty staggering amount of damage amplification for the team, which, granted, he sort of had to since he's releasing after the newly buffed Welt, who is a complete monster despite being a standard banner character. So it goes without saying that, at first glance, Blade is an incredibly powerful debuffer, arguably the best in the Nihility path. His personal damage, however, is going to heavily depend on allies and enemies both attacking frequently, meaning, depending on the team you pair him with and how many enemies are on the field, his own attack frequency is going to vary a lot. There will be some fights where you trigger his follow-up attack way more, giving him more damage and more energy for more ultimates, and other fights where you aren't able to launch as many follow-up attacks, wherein his main role is to just be a debuffer. Clearly, there are two main teams where Blade will be played in. Follow-up attack teams, which mainly center around Ashvale in the current meta, as well as Acheron teams, where Blade is meant to be a pseudo-revival for Acheron, in the same way Cypher was back during Cypher's release. In general, Blade just feels very similar to Cypher in terms of role and purpose in the meta. In Ashvale's teams, Ashvale's frequent attacks will obviously charge Blade's own follow-up attack much more frequently, especially with another support like Tribby on the team. In these teams, Blade's own personal damage will matter much more, especially thanks to Ashvale's follow-up attack buffs as well. In Acheron teams, this is where Blade's personal damage will be worse, not just due to receiving less buffs, but obviously nobody in an Acheron team attacks as frequently as Ashvale, thus charging Blade's follow-up attack and ultimate less. It's fine that he deals less personal damage in Acheron teams though, since he's offering so much more to Acheron in terms of damage amp as well as stacking her ultimate. Since Blade reapplies his debuffs every time an ally attacks, this means every single ally attack now charges Acheron's ultimate, so every single Hyacinth and Ika attack will now give Acheron a stack. Additionally, Blade also reapplies his debuffs every time an enemy attacks him, meaning Acheron also gets a stack whenever enemies attack Blade, which is basically every time an enemy takes a turn, since Blade has much higher taunt value within his ultimate zone. So, Blade combines the stacking of Silverwolf E2 with the stacking of Jiaoqiu. He makes every ally attack give an Acheron stack, just like Silverwolf's E2, and he gives Acheron a stack essentially every time an enemy attacks, which is what Jiaoqiu used to be known for. Blade just combines both of their stacking mechanics into his own kit, becoming by far the best stack generator for Acheron, as well as the strongest damage amplifier for her in general. He is basically everything Acheron mains could have possibly hoped for. Meanwhile, for Ashvale, the synergy between these two is really interesting. Ashvale wants allies that attack frequently to feed him energy energy, and Blade is sort of the exact same way, wanting allies that attack frequently to give him charges for his follow-up attack, which gives him energy. They both want frequently attacking allies, but neither of them are particularly frequent in their attacks. Again, Blade obviously starts attacking much more frequently in pure fiction or AoE content, where enemies are constantly hitting him for charge, but in a vacuum, the two of these characters feel like they're still waiting for a third teammate to round out their synergy with each other. Despite this, they still obviously work great together just because of how powerful their buffs are in tandem with each other, with their follow-up attack specific buffs, as well as effortlessly stacking 70% defense thread between both of their kits, increasing to 86% defense thread if you put the Pearl's Lightcone on Blade. It's pretty crazy, and Blade's kit definitely feels like it was mainly designed with Ashvale and Acheron as the two main synergies in mind. Of course, Blade's kit is strong enough that he can simply brute force his way into being a generalist support for many teams, even for Finon. Albeit Blade obviously gives no core flame stacks, but that's just an example of how powerful his debuffs are and how valuable he can be as a flex slot just for pure damage amp. He can even slot into break or DOT teams because of his general buffs. He definitely feels like a modern day Cypher being made to revive Acheron and follow-up attack teams, while being strong enough within the current meta to be a flexible support for many teams. To briefly touch upon his vertical investments, his Lightcone increases his max HP by 24% and essentially just inflicts a crit damage debuff on the enemies. But you can just think of it as essentially buffing his own crit damage by 60% and buffing the rest of his team's crit damage by 30%. It also gives him 20 energy at the start of each wave, which is never a good sign for his energy rotation, but we'll have to see how important this ends up being. Either way, it's definitely a very strong Lightcone, but since he's a Nihility character who can stack defense thread, especially when paired with Ashvale, Pearls is a very strong 4-star option for him, and a tutorial is also a consideration if you want to spam his ultimate more. So as good as his Lightcone is, he also definitely has good free-to-play options. Blade's Eidolons are a mix of supportive and offensive buffs. His E1 gives his zone 20% res pen, because why not add more debuffs into the mix? And it also has an interesting effect where it delays the action of his countdown by 15% every time the talent triggers his follow-up attack. So in theory, the E1 is giving him one extra turn inside of his ultimate before it runs out. His E2 increases the damage of his talent's follow-up attack by 50%, and then has a unique effect that turns all allies' ultimates into follow-up attacks, which is essentially an old simulated universe blessing now integrated into his kit. This should include his own ultimate, which is nice so that his ultimate nuke can now gain the extra follow-up attack damage bonus from himself and Ashvale. Additionally, follow-up attacks will now give Blade 2 charges instead of just 1 charge. This effect can trigger 9 times in between Blade's turns, but you'll practically never reach that cap, so don't worry about it too much. Obviously, the E2 is giving him even more follow-up attacks from his talent, which synergizes with his E1 to push back his countdown timer even more and keep him in his ultimate for as long as possible. His E3 and E5 are just talent level increases as usual. His E4 just increases his buffing by giving an extra 50% damage bonus for free, which is a pretty good E4 compared to other E4s, all things considered. Lastly, Blade's E6 gives him an extra charge when he takes damage or consumes HP. So hello, Hyacinth Lightcone synergy. And the damage multiplier of his nuke ultimate becomes 150% of its original multiplier. Or basically, he gains 50% true damage on his nuke ultimate. It's interesting that they made his E6 center around his ultimate instead of his talent's follow-up attacks, considering the rest of his Eidolons were focused on his talent's follow-up attacks. Either way, the Eidolons are all nice, but the E1's 20% res pen is the only notable one in terms of team-wide damage amp. Otherwise, his Eidolons are mainly focused on his own personal damage, as well as delaying his countdown timer. Overall, Blade is looking very strong and is looking like a modern-day Cypher. He is a bridge between the follow-up attack enjoyers and the Acheron mains, as well as being strong enough to be a general support who can find a lot of use on a lot of different accounts just by virtue of how powerful his damage amp is. However, I think the Blade and Ashvale team is clearly sitting with a vacant spot open, still waiting for someone else to take full advantage of their kits and tie everything together. But we will see. So, what do you think of Mortenax Blade's kit? Is he everything you'd hoped he would be, or is there something lacking for you? With his ability to slot into so many teams, which teams are you planning on using him in, if you're pulling for him? Let me know in the comments below. And be sure to like the video if you found it helpful or enjoyable at all. I will definitely have more coverage of Mortenax Blade, especially after I've gotten some hands-on time with him. And I'll update you all with my much more in-depth opinions on him after that. So consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss out on that. Thank you so much for watching, and with all of that said, until next time!